The morning air was crisp, the city still rubbing sleep from its eyes as Richard Lawson's black car pulled up to the curb outside the towering glass facade of Lawson Enterprises. It was just past 5:30. Most of his employees wouldn't arrive for at least 2 more hours, but Richard believed in starting early, before the noise, before the world demanded his attention. The lobby lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Silence wrapped the space like a heavy coat, but something was different. As he stepped through the doors, briefcase in hand, his gaze landed on a strange sight. There, on the sleek leather couch near the wall of windows, were two little girls curled up beside each other, fast asleep. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. Their arms were tucked beneath their heads, feet dangling over the edge, and they wore oversized uniforms, his company's janitor uniforms, sleeves folded, pants dragging. One had her hair in messy braids. The other clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit. Richard paused, a frown tugging at the edge of his mouth. For a moment, he didn't move. The girls didn't stir. It was as if the building itself held its breath. He turned to the security guard at the front desk. "Why are there children in my lobby?" His voice was low but sharp. The guard stood quickly, flustered. "Sir, we were going to wake them before the day shift. They've been here since last night. Belonged to one of the janitors, Maria. She begged to keep them here after her shift. Said she had no choice." Richard didn't respond. His eyes drifted back to the couch. He was a man used to control, order, discipline, structure. His world revolved around deals and deadlines, not small girls sleeping in public. And yet, there was something disarming in how peacefully they lay there. The older one stirred slightly, reaching for her sister's hand in her sleep. That simple gesture, quiet, instinctive, full of love, unsettled something in him. "Get Maria," he said finally. As the guard scurried away, Richard walked slowly toward the couch, his footsteps soft against the marble. He stood over the girls, studying the shadows under their eyes, the dirt smudged on their cuffs, the way one shoe had fallen off and rested neatly beside the couch leg. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was something else, something he didn't yet understand. A distant memory stirred, a cold floor, a thin blanket, the sound of his mother humming to distract him from hunger. He pushed the thought away, but it clung to him like fog. When Maria arrived, her eyes were red-rimmed, posture tight with shame. She began apologizing before he said a word, hands wringing as she explained how rent had gone up, how shelters were full, how she had no family left to turn to. She spoke quickly, not to excuse herself, but to protect her daughter's dignity. Her voice cracked when she said, "I just needed a warm place for them, sir. Just for a night." Richard said nothing for a long while. The girls continued to sleep behind him, unaware that their lives, and his, had already begun to change. He didn't know it yet, but that morning would stay with him forever. Not because of numbers or contracts or a line on a balance sheet, but because for the first time in years, something real had entered the building. And it had arrived in the form of two little girls, in borrowed uniforms, sleeping on a couch beneath the glow of his company's name. The office day had barely begun, but Richard Lawson was already unsettled. He sat in his corner office, glass walls, minimalist furniture, skyline view. But his mind wasn't on the reports his assistant had just laid on the desk. The image of those two girls still lingered like smoke in his chest. No matter how he tried to focus, the sight of their thin arms, the way one curled around the other for warmth, kept returning. He rarely paid attention to the janitorial staff. They were invisible by design, like the pipes that kept the water running or the wires that powered the lights. But Maria, their mother, now had a name, a story, a face that wouldn't fade. Later that morning, against habit, Richard asked his assistant to pull Maria's employee file. She hesitated. He never asked for files like this. When she returned, she set it down gently, unsure of what he was looking for. He flipped through it with a strange kind of care. Hired 4 years ago. No absences, no complaints, no commendations either. She was a ghost in the system, flawless, invisible, forgettable. Just the way the world often prefers women like her to be. By mid-morning, he had asked for Maria to meet with him in private. She arrived hesitantly, still wearing her night shift uniform. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "I'm not here to reprimand you," he said calmly, gesturing for her to sit. She didn't. Maria looked down. "I understand if I have to leave, sir, but I didn't know where else to go. My daughters are too young to be home alone. I tried to hide them. I really did." He studied her face. There were lines at the corners of her eyes, premature, not from age, but from strain. Her expression held that familiar tension he'd seen in people too proud to beg, but too exhausted to keep pretending. There was no drama in her voice, just fatigue. "Where are you staying?" he asked. Maria hesitated, then answered truthfully. "Nowhere permanent. A friend let me sleep on her couch for a few nights, but she's already got 4 kids. I didn't want to impose anymore. I thought just a night or two here. Somewhere warm." Richard sat back. The silence that followed stretched long. His empire ran on efficiency, on productivity, on margins. But here was a woman who scrubbed the floors of that empire every night, going unnoticed, unsupported, and now bringing her daughters into the very building she was barely surviving in. He could have called HR, handed off the problem, turned his back as he'd done so many times before, but something stopped him. "Do your girls go to school?" he asked. Maria nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I make sure of it. I walk them there before I sleep. It's the only routine we have left." There was a flicker of pride in her voice when she said that. School, education, a better future. He recognized that tone. He'd heard it in his own mother once, on the night she swore things would get better. He dismissed Maria gently, telling her to finish her shift and that he'd look into things. It was vague, but it was something. She thanked him quietly and left, never asking for help, not even once. As she disappeared down the hallway, Richard remained in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. Outside the window, the city roared with ambition and indifference. But inside, something had shifted. He wasn't sure what he was going to do yet, but he knew that walking away was no longer an option. The janitor had become more than a footnote. She was a mirror, and what he saw in her reflection demanded something of him he hadn't offered in a very long time: humanity. The next night, Richard stayed late. He told no one, not his assistant, not the board, not the woman waiting for him at home, who had long since stopped asking why he worked so much. Something restless had taken hold of him. He didn't understand it fully, but he felt the pull. A quiet need to see the truth for himself, not through paperwork or secondhand reports, but with his own eyes. He sat in the shadows of the mezzanine above the lobby, where the glass railing gave a wide view of the floor below. Around 11, the janitorial team arrived like clockwork, moving silently in pairs and trios, wheeling carts of supplies through the polished corridors. Among them was Maria. She walked with purpose, back straight, eyes forward, as if nothing in her life had ever broken her stride. Trailing close behind were the 2 girls. They were freshly bathed, hair combed neatly, wearing simple dresses beneath zip-up jackets. One held a sketch pad and a few stubby pencils. The other clutched a paperback chapter book too big for her hands. They followed their mother quietly until she opened the storage closet behind the utility hallway. Maria knelt down and laid out a folded blanket over the floor, then took out a small thermos and 2 paper cups. Richard watched as the girls sipped hot tea, probably weak, probably cheap, like it was something sacred. No toys, no tablets, no distractions, just each other, a blanket, and the soft hum of the building's nighttime rhythm. Maria kissed each of their foreheads, then whispered something that made the younger girl laugh, and then she shut the door behind them and returned to work. He remained still, watching through the glass as Maria scrubbed floors, emptied bins, and wiped the chrome elevator buttons clean with practiced efficiency. Her face never changed. There was no visible resentment, no collapse into self-pity, just quiet determination. A woman surviving one day at a time in a building full of people who never saw her. Richard's chest felt tight. This wasn't charity. This was dignity, playing out in silence. Around midnight, he left his perch and walked the halls. He passed Maria near the executive wing. She didn't see him at first. Her back was turned as she knelt beside a planter, scooping away dead leaves and rearranging the soil. Her hands moved gently, almost like she was tending to something alive, something that mattered. When she finally noticed him, she jumped to her feet. "Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't realize anyone was still here." "I was working late," he said simply, unsure what else to offer. Maria nodded, unsure too. She stood there, her uniform smudged, her face flushed from work, but her eyes met his now, and for a second neither looked away. "Do they sleep well in there?" he asked softly. Maria hesitated, then said, "They don't complain, and when they wake up, they always thank me for making it feel like a home." That word, home, echoed through him like a hollow knock on a door he hadn't opened in years. He left soon after without saying more, but as his driver pulled away from the building, Richard turned back for one last look. The lobby lights glowed behind the glass. Somewhere inside, two children were asleep on a blanket in a storage room, and their mother was wiping handprints from the glass doors of an empire she didn't belong to. But for the first time in his life, Richard wondered if maybe she did. If maybe the people who kept the lights on and the floors clean were the only ones still tethered to something real. That night, he couldn't sleep. The world he'd built had never felt so hollow. The next morning, Richard stood in front of his bathroom mirror, tie dangling untied around his neck, toothbrush untouched on the counter. His reflection stared back, but it felt unfamiliar. His jaw was tense, eyes darker than usual. Sleep had eluded him, and when it came, it dragged old memories to the surface, ones he'd spent years learning to ignore. He remembered a night when he was 9 years old, sitting on the edge of a worn mattress in a church basement, the hum of a space heater the only sound in the room. His mother sat beside him, arms wrapped around her knees, whispering stories about better days. Her voice cracked from exhaustion, but her smile never faltered. "We just need to hold on," she said. "Tomorrow might be different." But tomorrow hadn't been different. Not for a long time. Now, decades later, that memory returned with painful clarity. He splashed cold water on his face and forced himself to move through the motions of his morning. Suit, coffee, briefcase. But the sharp edges of his past refused to dull. When he arrived at the office, the lobby was already filled with the polished rhythm of corporate life. Assistants rushed past in heels and loafers, phones rang in practiced cadence, and the receptionist greeted him with a trained smile. But something had changed. The marble looked colder, the light harsher, and the couch, once just a piece of decor, now held weight it hadn't the week before. He walked past it without pausing, but in his mind, he saw them again. Those two small girls curled together in oversized uniforms, trying to find warmth in a place built for profit. The day blurred into meetings and spreadsheets, but Richard's focus frayed at the edges. During a strategy session, one of the senior partners presented a plan to cut night shift staff and outsource cleaning services to save overhead. The numbers made sense. The room nodded in agreement. Richard did not. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the proposal on the screen. It was efficient. It was logical. It would impress investors. But all he could picture was Maria, her hands raw from bleach, her daughters asleep behind a closet door. "No," he said, his voice firm. The room turned to him. "We're not outsourcing the janitorial team." A few brows rose. "Sir, with respect, cutting those positions saves nearly $500,000 a year." "Then find it somewhere else," Richard replied. "We're not balancing the books on the backs of people who clean our offices at night." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, unfamiliar. He didn't explain himself further. He didn't need to. After the meeting, he walked through the building without his usual entourage. He paused at the back corridors, near the service elevators and laundry closets. These spaces were narrow, sterile, forgotten. Yet here was where lives unfolded in quiet resilience. He realized just how far he'd drifted from the world he'd come from. He had built an empire that mirrored the very systems that once failed him. He had become everything his younger self had feared: powerful, untouchable, blind. That night he found himself back at the lobby couch, long after everyone else had left. He stood in front of it without sitting, as if the act would somehow desecrate its new meaning. Then, almost without thinking, he walked to his office, opened his safe, and pulled out a small metal tin, the only thing he'd kept from his childhood. Inside, faded photos and a church bulletin from the shelter days. He hadn't looked at them in years. He stared at his mother's handwriting on the corner of the flyer. "Keep going. You're meant for more." He thought he understood it back then, that more meant wealth, power, buildings with his name on them. But now, staring at the soft ink in her familiar script, he realized he'd misunderstood her. She hadn't meant more money. She'd meant more kindness, more humanity, more meaning. And perhaps after all these years, he still had a chance to become the man she believed he could be. It began with small, quiet gestures, ones that Richard never announced and Maria never asked for. The following week, the cleaning supply closet where her daughter stayed was outfitted with a small fold-out cot, clean sheets, a portable heater, and a reading lamp. No one said who approved it, no memo, no permission slips, just a quiet upgrade, like the building had blinked and suddenly remembered the children hiding inside it. Maria noticed immediately. She lingered in the doorway longer that night, her eyes tracing the shape of the cot as if unsure whether to be grateful or afraid. It wasn't just furniture, it was acknowledgement. And for someone like her, used to being unseen, it felt almost dangerous. She didn't say anything to Richard when their paths crossed near the staff elevators the next day. She simply nodded, eyes lowered, lips tight. But something had shifted between them. An invisible thread now pulled taut with unspoken understanding. Later that week, Richard instructed his assistant to add a line item for employee wellness incidentals in the monthly operational budget. A vague, ambiguous phrase, but it gave him room to maneuver, enough to have a catering vendor deliver warm soup and bread at the end of the night shift. Enough to place a box of children's books in the break room. No one questioned it. Most assumed it was some PR initiative he was trialing. Let them assume. One evening, as he walked through the lower level after hours, he found the two girls sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing on the back of old office memos. They didn't see him at first. The older one had drawn a tall glass building with flowers out front and a bright sun in the corner. The younger girl was drawing people, stick figures with wide, happy mouths. He stepped closer, quietly. The older girl looked up. Her eyes were wide but not frightened. She studied him, then smiled, shy and small. "You're the man from the glass room," she said. Richard blinked. "The glass room?" She pointed upward. "Where the whole city looks small." He chuckled softly. "Yes, that's me." The younger one piped in. "Are you the one who gave us the warm bed?" He hesitated. "Sort of. I just made sure the right people knew it was needed." She seemed satisfied with the answer. Then she said without irony, "You always look sad." That caught him off guard. He crouched down, resting on one knee. "Do I?" She nodded with childlike certainty, like someone who forgot something important. Her words hit harder than she could have known. He looked at the crayon in her hand, the yellow smudge on her cheek, the absolute clarity in her expression. "I guess maybe I did," he said. After that, they began to greet him when they saw him. Little waves, timid smiles. He never lingered long, never made it into a performance. But he started to notice how much those brief moments mattered. They weren't afraid of him. They weren't impressed by his title, his suits, his power. They simply saw a man who had once been invisible himself. Maria remained cautious. She accepted the changes, the comforts, the small mercies, but she never presumed. She continued to clean with the same diligence, refused shortcuts, and reminded her daughters to stay polite, quiet, grateful. One evening, as Richard passed her in the hallway, she finally spoke. "I don't know why you're helping us," she said, her voice steady, "but I want you to know I haven't forgotten how to stand on my own." He nodded. "I know you haven't." Then she added more quietly, "But thank you for seeing us." He didn't reply, just offered a faint smile and kept walking. That night, for the first time in a long while, Richard didn't stay in his office until the lights burned out. He went home early, not to catch up on sleep or reports, but because he wanted to sit in the quiet and let himself feel what had been buried for too long. The bond forming between him and the janitor's children was not about pity. It was something simpler, something sacred: recognition. A man who once slept on church floors had met two little girls doing the same, and somewhere in the middle, they'd found each other. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was where redemption began. The contrast had never felt so sharp. In the boardroom, surrounded by polished wood, glass pitchers of mineral water, and executives in tailored suits, Richard sat at the head of the table, listening to projections about international expansion. The language was cold, precise. Numbers, charts, growth margins. Every word was dressed in confidence. No one noticed his silence. He was known for it. But today he wasn't strategizing. He was remembering the janitor's closet. Just that morning he had passed by early and glimpsed the older girl reading aloud to her sister under the soft light of the reading lamp he'd had installed. The words were shaky but brave. The younger one had leaned in close, eyes wide, listening like it was magic. Maria was nearby, wiping down the hallway floor with slow, practiced strokes. That image stayed with him now, cutting through profit graphs and brand strategy like a whispered truth in a room built on noise. Across from him, a partner pitched a plan to restructure the cleaning schedule to reduce overtime pay. It was efficient, cost-effective, and in line with industry trends. The board nodded along, but Richard raised a hand. "No," he said. The partner blinked. "Sir, we're not cutting hours for the janitorial staff." An awkward pause followed. Someone cleared their throat. "With respect, Richard, this move could improve quarterly earnings and free up resources for—" "We can't keep pretending numbers are more important than people," he interrupted. "Those floors don't shine themselves. The trash doesn't walk itself out. Our staff deserves better than invisibility." There was a long silence. Some exchanged glances. Others shifted in their seats. The CFO tried a gentle approach. "We understand your sentiment, but this is about sustainability in the long term." "Then let's build something sustainable and human," Richard replied, "or we'll just be another empire destined to collapse under its own cold ambition." It wasn't a debate. It was a declaration. The room quieted. After the meeting, Richard walked back to his office, his footsteps slower than usual. He passed interns typing frantically, assistants balancing 3 phones, junior execs chasing deals with wide, eager eyes. And then, as if drawn by instinct, He took the elevator down to the lowest floor. He found Maria in the supply hallway, rinsing out a mop bucket. She stood when she saw him, her face unreadable. "Sir," he gave her a quiet nod. "Do your girls like books?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, especially the older one. She reads everything." "I've been thinking about putting a reading nook in the break room. A real one. Bean bags, children's shelves, maybe a small cabinet for school supplies." Maria hesitated, as if trying to measure the line between gratitude and pride. "They'd love that," she said finally. He glanced down the hallway. "They deserve a space where they're not just waiting, a place where they feel like they belong." Her voice softened. "You don't have to do all this." "I know," he said, "but I should have seen all of it sooner." That night, while most of the city buzzed with late dinners and endless deadlines, Richard stayed behind. He walked the building floor by floor, not to inspect, not to manage, but to see. The night staff, the flicker of weary eyes, the quiet rhythm of work that no one clapped for. He walked past a window where his reflection stared back at him. A man in a $1,000 suit, walking through mop water and chemical-scented air, looking more like himself than he had in years. Somewhere between the boardroom and the broom closet, Richard Lawson was starting to remember what kind of man he used to want to be. And the truth was, it didn't matter how high he'd climbed if he'd forgotten how to bend down and listen. In a world that worshiped titles, he was learning again how to earn the only one that truly mattered: human. The following week brought rain. It fell against the glass tower in slow, steady sheets, soaking the sidewalks and making the city blur outside Richard's window. From 30 stories up, the world looked quiet, almost gentle. But downstairs, the real weight of it pressed on Maria's shoulders, just as it always had. She moved through the building like she belonged to its bones. No matter the hour, no matter how tired, she walked with purpose. Her hands, always busy, scrubbing, folding, lifting, held a kind of grace that Richard found himself admiring more than he expected. She never asked for pity. She never lingered. She worked like someone who knew the difference between survival and surrender. The girls had settled into a rhythm. Richard noticed it each time he passed by after hours, the older one sketching on printer scraps, the younger one humming softly as she flipped through picture books. They no longer flinched when he walked by. In fact, they greeted him now as if he were something ordinary, safe. One night he lingered longer than usual. The hallway was quiet. Maria was on her knees beside the elevator, scrubbing the metal panel until it shone. Her hair was tied back, damp from the rain she must have walked through on the way in. She didn't look up when she spoke. "I know people are talking," she said. Richard paused. "About what?" "About you and me. About why the CEO suddenly cares what happens to a janitor." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely. "Let them talk." She straightened up, wiping sweat from her brow with the sleeve of her uniform. "You're putting a target on your back. The others don't say it to my face, but I see the way they look at me, like I did something wrong by letting you notice me." "You didn't let me notice you," he said quietly. "I was just late to the truth." She exhaled slowly. "I'm not ashamed of my work. It feeds my girls. It's honest." "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm still watching." Maria gave a small, guarded smile. "Then watch this," she said, and dropped back to her knees, returning to her scrubbing without ceremony. He didn't say anything more. He just stood there, the CEO of the building, watching a woman polish a surface he'd never looked at closely before. Her every motion said what words didn't need to. This job wasn't her defeat, it was her offering. The next day, Richard made another change, a quiet one. He arranged for every night shift worker to receive a raise, not enough to draw headlines, but enough to make a difference. Enough to replace worn-out shoes, enough to buy a coat without worrying how to feed their children. He also authorized paid sick leave for janitorial staff, something no one had asked for because they'd long accepted they wouldn't get it. HR hesitated, unsure why these sudden reforms mattered so much to him. But he didn't explain. He simply signed the papers and moved on. Later that week, Maria found a sealed envelope in her locker. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing me what dignity looks like. RL." She read it in silence, then tucked it deep into her coat pocket near her heart. That night, as she wiped down the front doors, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. Strong shoulders, tired eyes, and the soft curve of a smile she hadn't worn in months. Behind her, her daughters giggled over a new puzzle someone had left in the storage closet. And far above, Richard watched from the mezzanine once more. A man beginning to understand that real wealth had little to do with money and everything to do with the people we too often fail to see. He hadn't saved her. She had reminded him how to be human. The couch in the lobby had returned to silence. It sat under the soft morning lights, its cushions neat, its leather polished. Just another piece of corporate decor to most who walked past. But to Richard, it had become something else entirely, a symbol, a threshold. The place where his carefully curated life had begun to unravel, and where something warmer, messier, and far more real had begun to take its place. It was the girl's birthday. He'd found the date by accident while glancing through the HR emergency contact files. Just a small notation. Maria Cruz, dependents. 2. Sophia. 8. Leela. 6. Birthday, October 17th. He had stared at the words for a long time, then made a quiet decision. Early that morning before sunrise, he arrived with a simple bouquet, wildflowers, not roses, and a gift-wrapped box containing art supplies and 2 well-worn children's novels from his own childhood library. He set them gently on the couch. No card, no announcement, just the offering. At 7, the night shift ended. Maria arrived to collect her daughters as always. She moved quickly, efficiently, preparing them for the walk to school. But when she stepped into the lobby, she stopped cold. Sophia and Lila stood frozen before the couch, eyes wide. "Mom!" Leela whispered. "They're for us." Maria's gaze locked on the flowers. She didn't speak for a moment. Then slowly she stepped forward, touching the edge of the bouquet as if afraid it might disappear. The older girl had already torn the paper on the box. Her face lit up as she pulled out colored pencils, sketch pads, and paints. "I can draw real things now," Sophia whispered. Maria swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she gathered the flowers into her arms. She knew without asking who had left them. That evening, Richard received a short email from an unfamiliar address. No subject line, just a few sentences. "They loved the gifts. I didn't know they could smile that wide. Thank you." Maria. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The quiet between them had already become its own language. Later that week, he took a detour on his way home. It had been years since he visited the cemetery. The gate creaked just like he remembered. He carried no flowers, only the tin of old memories he kept in his office drawer. He sat by his mother's gravestone, brushing leaves from her name. "I did something right," he whispered. Finally. The wind stirred the trees above him, and for a moment he felt like a child again, alone, aching, hoping someone would see him. But this time, the ache didn't feel empty. It felt like memory, like something he could hold without being hollowed out by it. Back at the office, the girls began leaving notes for him, tiny folded scraps of paper tucked under his door. Crayon drawings of stick figures and suits and high heels, tiny suns in every corner. One had written, "Thank you, Mr. Glassroom. Love, Lila." He pinned it to the inside of his briefcase. The couch remained untouched for days after, as if waiting for another chapter. But Richard didn't need the couch anymore to remind him of what mattered. He had already begun to build something better, out of quiet choices, out of human things. And slowly, the building itself started to change, not in structure, but in tone. Employees who once passed Mariah without a glance began nodding hello. HR requested funds for after-hours childcare. One executive anonymously offered to pay for the girls' school lunch program. It was as if, through a single act of attention, Richard had held up a mirror, and the people inside his empire were finally seeing what they had ignored for too long. It didn't make headlines, but it made a difference. And that, for the first time in his life, felt like the legacy he actually wanted to leave behind. The document sat on Richard's desk for days, untouched at first. Just a concept proposal drafted by a junior analyst in HR, inspired in part by quiet observations. It was titled Family Support Initiative, Reinventing Corporate Culture for Working Parents and Night Staff. No one expected the CEO to read it. It was more of a symbolic gesture, a way to say, we see what you're doing, and maybe we want to help. But Richard read it. Every line, it was bold, offering subsidized childcare, emergency housing assistance, school supply grants, and flexible hours for custodial and service staff. It even suggested using vacant office space after hours for employee family programs. To most companies, it would sound radical, costly, idealistic. But Richard didn't see it that way. He saw it as overdue. He called an emergency board meeting. When the executives gathered, they expected the usual: financial targets, mergers, market strategies. But Richard stood at the head of the table. No slides, no numbers, just conviction. We built this company on the backs of people no one ever talks about, he began. We praise innovation, speed, scale, but ignore the ones who keep the lights on, who scrub the floors, who survive in the shadows of the systems we've made. The room shifted uncomfortably. I'm not asking for a vote, he continued. I'm telling you that starting next quarter, we're implementing the Family Support Initiative. All of it. No PR campaign, no press release, just quiet, meaningful change. One executive raised an eyebrow. That's millions in unplanned expenditure. Investors will ask questions. Let them ask, Richard replied. I'll tell them the truth. Another scoffed softly. What truth is that? That for all our success, we've failed at the one thing that actually matters: being human. The room went still. They didn't agree, not all of them, but they didn't stop him. Over the next month, changes unfolded quietly but powerfully. A daycare space was opened in a previously unused conference wing. HR created a confidential housing support fund. Night shift staff were offered meal stipends and transportation credits. The break rooms were redesigned, not just with microwaves and vending machines, but shelves filled with books, puzzles, and toys. For the first time, the company felt like a place that saw everyone, not just the ones with corner offices and stock options. Maria noticed the difference instantly. One night, she passed by the new reading nook and saw her daughters curled up on beanbags, the older one reading a new illustrated storybook aloud. She paused in the doorway, tears filling her eyes, not from sadness, but relief. That night, she knocked on Richard's office door. He looked up from his desk, surprised. She rarely sought him out. She stepped inside, holding a small container wrapped in foil. I made you something, she said softly. Just a thank you. It's arroz con leche, my mother's recipe. He took it gently. You didn't have to. I wanted to. They sat in silence for a moment, then Maria spoke again. I don't know what changed in you, but whatever it was, I hope it never fades. He nodded, struggling to find the right words. I think I stopped trying to run from who I used to be. She smiled. Good. He was probably worth remembering. As she left, he looked down at the small container in his hands. It was warm, humble, real. The next morning, as staff filtered into the building, they were greeted by something simple but profound. A framed photo hung in the lobby just above the couch. It showed a janitor's gloved hand holding a child's hand, both reaching for the same doorknob. Beneath it was a plaque that read, "This building belongs to all of us. No fanfare, no logo, just truth." And from that day forward, Richard Lawson stopped being the CEO who ran a company and became the man who changed it. Not through brilliance or dominance, but through the decision to care deeply and deliberately about the people no one else had ever seen. Time passed and the company settled into its new rhythm. The once silent nights in the building were now gently alive with quiet laughter, the sound of bedtime stories echoing softly through the corridors. The janitorial staff, who once moved like ghosts through the marble halls, now paused occasionally to chat, to smile, to exist without shrinking. The couches in the lobby, once simply furniture, had become symbols. One in particular, the small beige couch near the entrance, remained untouched by renovations. No one dared remove it. Everyone knew why. Richard stood in the lobby one evening, watching as Maria's youngest daughter climbed onto that couch after her mother's shift ended. She pulled a blanket over her tiny shoulders and hugged a worn teddy bear, the same one she had carried the first night he saw them. He approached slowly. "Hey," he said gently, "you look comfortable." The little girl looked up and nodded sleepily. "It's my favorite spot." Richard smiled. "Mine too." Maria joined them a moment later, her hair pulled back, her face glowing with a kind of peace he hadn't seen in her before. "We're heading home," she said. "The girls have school tomorrow, and we have a real place now, thanks to the housing grant." "I'm glad," he said quietly. "You deserve it." She hesitated, then looked at him with something deeper than gratitude, understanding. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "That night," she began, "when you saw us sleeping here, what were you thinking?" Richard looked down, then back at her. "I thought that I'd built a palace and forgotten to invite the people who kept it from falling apart. I saw myself in a way I hadn't in years, and I was ashamed." Maria nodded slowly. "You didn't walk away. That's what matters." He paused. "I almost did. But your daughter called me back." She gave a soft laugh. "She does that, sees people." Richard looked back at the couch. "She reminded me of something I'd buried. How much I needed someone to see me when I was young, when I had nothing." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The building's lights dimmed slightly for the night cycle. The city outside buzzed on. Then Maria reached into her bag and handed him a folded piece of paper. "My daughter drew this, said it's you." Richard opened it. Crayon lines, bright colors. It was a drawing of him holding hands with two little girls, standing in front of a huge building. Above them, in childlike lettering, it read, "Mr. Richard helps everyone go home." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Tell her I'll keep it forever. She already knows." As they left, Richard remained in the lobby for a while longer. He sat on the couch. That couch, the one that started everything. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to be anyone else. Just a man, sitting in the building he had once ruled, now finally belonging to the people who needed it most. There was no press release, no headlines. But somewhere in that city, a child slept soundly in a bed she never had before. A mother stopped fearing every paycheck. And a company, once towering and cold, had opened its heart. All because one night, a little girl in a janitor uniform fell asleep on a couch, and someone finally noticed.